and the city's first ever Chief Marketing Officer. It's my true pleasure to welcome all of you today to today's webinar, Catalyzing Neighborhood Investment, how to direct public and private investment to Black and Latinx neighborhoods at scale. This is the second series of 3 webinars organized by the Chicago Community Trust that seeks to address the causes of and offer real solutions to the racial and ethnic wealth gap. For more than a century, CCT has worked to strengthen Chicago's region's economy and civic infrastructure through a host of initiatives, large and small. The Trust programs strive to bring all stakeholders to the table, from private citizens and civic organizations to public officials and business leaders, in order to confront and overcome the most pressing issues facing our community here in Chicago. In the Chicago region today, one of those issues is the massive and widening racial ethnic wealth gap. According to Trust CEOs Dr. Helene Gale, closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap could be Chicago's 21st century's moonshot opportunity. And the Trust has 3 strategies to achieve it: growing household wealth, catalyzing neighborhood investment, and building collective power. Our organization, World Business Chicago, is delighted to support the Trust mission and to serve today as the co-host for this webinar, which focuses on a second of these strategies. In these times of unprecedented economic, political, and social uncertainty, it is more important than ever to have robust and transparent conversations about racial and ethnic equity and to take real action towards achieving it. I look forward to hearing from all the panelists about what we can do to promote, encourage targeted, sustained, and equitable investment to our city's many ethnically and racially diverse neighborhoods and communities across all 77 neighborhoods. And without further ado, it's my true pleasure and honor to present the moderator of today's panels, Dr. Helene Gale. And I was so thrilled to see her yesterday getting vaccinated with our Mayor Lightfoot. And I just talked with her, she's doing great. And it's a great symbol again to encourage all of us to get vaccinated when it's our turn. Dr. Helene Gale, it's your turn, it's your platform.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. And we're so pleased to be having this panel today co-sponsored with World Business Chicago. So thank you so much. And thanks for stepping into that very important role. And yes, I definitely want people to see that getting the vaccine, you can get up the next day and do a panel and anything else you want to do. So when it's your turn, please do get vaccinated. So it is my real pleasure to be part of this and to be moderating this panel, which I think will be a really spirited discussion. And as Michael said, at the Chicago Community Trust, we have put closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap as our highest priority. And in that context, the issue of investing in neighborhoods where there has been massive and long-standing disinvestment is a critical piece of that. There's a lot of data, and we'll probably talk about some of it as we get into it. But as an example, the Urban Institute in 2019 showed that for every dollar in private capital invested in Chicago's majority Black neighborhoods, majority white neighborhoods benefited from 4.6 or almost $5, so almost a 1 in 5. And when you look at Latinx communities, it's just in between that, so about 1 in 3. So, we know that there's massive private lack of investment, private dollars. And we know that even within our public dollars, we don't have as much as we need to actually invest in these. But I think we will spend a fair amount of time talking about how these partnerships between the public sector and the private sector are so critical as we think of this issue of the important investment opportunities that there are in underinvested neighborhoods. So let me start by just first introducing our panelists. I will give you brief bios and then we will go into a discussion. We also have at the end of this for about 10 minutes, hopefully if time permits, to have question and answer. We encourage you to type in questions that you have in the Q&A, not in the chat. We'll be looking at the Q&A to take your questions, the little Q&A box. So Without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist, Maurice, Commissioner Maurice Cox. Commissioner Cox was appointed as the Commissioner of the Department of Planning and Development in 2019. He came to us from the same position as the Director of Planning and Development for the city of Detroit, and we'll talk a bit about some of his Detroit experiences. He has a broad range of roles in the area of planning. He was the former design director for the National Endowment of the Arts under George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. He also served in a variety of capacities in New Orleans. He was was the mayor of Charlottesville. So he has a real in-depth knowledge of how the public sector works and has had a vast experience in the area of planning and development. Robin Hackey is the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Community Investment. Since 2007, Robin has raised and managed impact investment funds as director of capital innovation at Living Cities. She also served as a senior fellow at the Kresge Foundation, where she researched and incubated a capital absorption practice to help local leaders strengthen their community investment ecosystem, advised foundations on the issues of investment, including systemic racism and achieving equity and opportunity in communities as we think about development. And last but not least is Carlos Nelson, who's the CEO of Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation, having joined the organization in 2003. He comes with an engineering background and many years of working directly in that capacity. And he is the inaugural winner of the Chicago Prize, a $2 million grant competition at the Pritzker Traubert Foundation that sought to invest in collective initiatives using physical development to spur economic activity. And we're very pleased that the always growing Auburn Gresham, which is a collaborative with his organization, was that first inaugural award, and we'll, I know, hear more about that. So let me just start out. Maybe I'll begin with you, Commissioner Cox. You know, you took your current position, as I mentioned, doing similar work in Detroit. Say a bit about what are some of the learnings from Detroit, but also what you see are some of the differences as you thought about your role in working to achieve economic equity and investment in disinvested communities.
So thank you, Helene, for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's something very, very dear to my heart, and that is strategic, equitable development in Black and Brown communities. And in many ways, Detroit was a wonderful place to test ideas because of the composition of the city, and it is one of the largest majority African-American cities in America, and is seeing a resurgence in its downtown, while at the same time it was losing African-American population. So part of it was trying to stem the decline and the exodus of the Black middle class from this city that was seeing a resurgence. And if you think about that, that sounds a little bit like Chicago, right? Whose downtown is seeing a vibrant resurgence, and it is also growing its population. At the same time, it is losing the Black and Brown population. So how could you, what's wrong here? And so I think in Detroit, there was a clear sense that we want to stem the tide of the African-American middle class leaving. And to do that, you have to focus on the places where they live. You have to have a neighborhood first strategy. And so we actually started to look at what were the amenities that people would expect to find in a vibrant, healthy community. stable single-family housing, greater housing choice, a place to shop locally and patronize locally owned businesses, neighborhood parks, access to transit. I mean, you just think about all of those things that we consider a part of a vibrant neighborhood life. And the question is, how do you do that in a place where the market does not naturally want to go and doesn't acknowledge often the buying power in those communities? So if you think about Chicago and you think about a community like Austin, which is on the far west side of the city, there's $160 million annually that leaves that community and goes just a half a mile further west to Oak Park. What if we set in motion a framework that would capture a percentage of those dollars and keep them in the community, build local wealth, support local business creation, and truly give people the kind of cross-section of amenities? And that's really the challenge that Mayor Lightfoot set out for us, not just to do it in Austin, but to do it in 10 communities across the South and West Side, starting from the places with this notion of how do we make all of those amenities that we all expect in our daily comings and goings in our neighborhoods, how do we make that available in Black and Brown communities? And to do it, you have to have almost a holy alliance between the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the philanthropic sector. And I think that's the stage that has been set here in Chicago through the Invest Southwest initiative.
And I think an important thing that you mentioned when you were describing the Detroit experience was the fact that there was a specific and intentional vision around that, and that these things don't just happen. So I don't know if you want to say a bit about, how you think, and you started with the Invest Southwest, how important it is that this vision of equity is really driving this, and how do we all kind of think about feeding into what is this broader vision?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so development isn't inherently equitable. So you have to force or almost gerrymander it to the issue of serving those who are already there, and marshaling the capital to not just have public investment, but to have that multiplier effect that you describe in terms of the difference between development that happens in majority white communities and the multiplier of effect that is needed to get public dollars to catalyze private dollars. And I think that is the key, to use those public dollars in a way that are catalytic, that can be to leverage those nonprofit and community-based organizations to bring private capital to bear. And in Detroit, we had to create a neighborhood strategic investment fund, which I would think is kind of the equivalent of the millions of dollars that Mayor Lightfoot set aside for private development to happen. So we now know that if we put in 25%, we can leverage that for 75% of private dollars or philanthropic dollars. And we're seeing that play out in very discrete development opportunities that have criterias to build local wealth embedded in the criteria for these projects. So it's a much more proactive. We're not waiting for developers to appear. We are going out and cultivating those development projects and allowing communities, by their exposure to the development process, to drive the development vision. That's a really key piece of it. So when development happens, they are ready for it, they can shape it, and it's an open and transparent process. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that maybe leads into something I wanted to ask you, Robin. I think as you made the statement, development isn't inherently equitable, and we need to almost intentionally think about how we're putting the incentives. Now, you spend a lot of your time working with communities on developing the ecosystem so that they are able to access resources for investment. Could you talk a bit about that and why that is such an important component of this?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me. I want to pick up on three things that Commissioner Cox said in the answer, actually, because I agree very much with the approach that he's laying out. In most places, most of the time, we're operating in a market system, in a capitalist system, and investment tends to flow to the things that are the best known, the most profitable, and the easiest. And in order to overcome that kind of natural tendency in the system that we're in, we have to get money to go uphill to the places that we want it to go rather than downhill to the kind of easiest things. And community investment is kind of the pump that gets the money uphill. And so in order to get that pump working in an ecosystem way, not just a single transaction, but a series of transformations that really achieve the vision that Commissioner Cox was talking about, we have to really think carefully about operating in a different way, not transaction by transaction, not reactively to a single developer who comes with an idea or a parcel, but with a vision, as was mentioned, for what is it that we're trying to achieve. Because what we've seen in the work that we do around the country is that the supply of capital is pretty well organized. Investors know what they want. Investors are very good at specifying a certain level of risk and a certain level of return. The demand for capital in communities is not nearly as well organized. And in our experience, the resources actually follow coherence. So if we can get communities together to articulate what they want, not just a single transaction, we want a grocery store on the corner, but a vision for their community and a pipeline of investable opportunities that actually add up to that vision, then all of a sudden the investors are really compelled to overcome the kind of natural tendency to go downhill by the fact that they are doing something that is worthwhile and important, and especially at this moment, connected to the time that we're in. And so what we have been finding around the country is that those communities like Detroit, and we're hoping like the efforts in Chicago, that are able to say, hey, lots of stakeholders are going to come together with the community, with hospitals, with CDFIs and foundations to say this is the most important thing to be doing with discretionary investment dollars right now. That's what it takes to make a pipeline move. And we strongly recommend that people work at the level, not of individual deals, but of pipelines of deals, because that's how you achieve scale, that's how you get to momentum, and that's how you can catalyze change that's not just, oh my, we have an opportunity zone and it's going to be good for an investor to put money here, but here's an investment that the community really wants, and that's going to make other things possible as well.
Well, if that's not a perfect lead off to Carlos and the work that he's doing, I don't know what is. So, you know, a lot of the things that you touched on is how do you paint that vision so people, so it's a win-win for communities as well as development. How do you get people to think about your community as being investable, and how do you paint that picture? So Carlos, I'd love you to, you know, talk a bit about, you know, how you came up with the vision that you have, you know, how is it embedded in community, and then how were you able to convince not only Chicago Prize, but, you know, beyond that, that Auburn Gresham is investable and is worth investing in?
Absolutely. Well, also thank you for having me, Dr. Gales, and I'm privileged to be here with Commissioner Cox and Robin Hackey as well. And so to answer your question, it's interesting. One of the things that the commissioner mentioned is, you know, being prepared, being ready for when development happens. And I would say, you know, we're looking at it from a slightly different lens. So here in this work, we're really looking to initiate the development ourselves. As it relates to the private market, our communities have waited for decades, generations for the private market to really do what's right, what's fair. And invariably the poison of racism, structural racism, systemic racism, oftentimes explicit racism, rears its evil head and really results in land exploitation in our communities or exploiting the people, the residents, and all of this restricting our ability to build wealth in our community, really feeding and in fact fueling this racial wealth gap that is persistent. And in fact, and once dollars have been extracted and or the market has shifted, or a CEO in some faraway land or says, you know, it's time to pull the plug on that development, on that project, we're often left with vacant, boarded up buildings, vacant land on our key commercial corridors, no less. And this is one of the reasons that we're really hopeful with this exciting Invest Southwest initiative led, by Commissioner Cox. So the private sector needs to see and needs to understand that Auburn Gresham and communities like Auburn Gresham, this is fertile soil for investment. Chicago has a strong ecosystem of community-based developers. I think Robin just mentioned that. And community-based developers are not risk averse, and they're led by people of color. And many of us hail from the same neighborhoods that we are working so hard and so diligently to rebuild. They need to understand that there is money to be made and returns on investment to be realized in our communities, especially when the private sector, and this is really important, and this is really our quest, really when they embrace the local developers and CBOs as partners, as true and equitable investment partners. And this is really, Dr. Gales, the movement of Auburn Gresham always growing. I also wanted to mention one other thing and piggyback on something that Maurice also had mentioned when he talked about, an alliance of public partners, private partners, not-for-profit partners, and philanthropy. Being a part of the city's effort to rectify a legacy of inequities. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge this shift, this paradigm shift that is actually happening right now in philanthropy in our marginalized communities, led by United Way of Metro Chicago, led by the Chicago Community Trust and others, providing organizations like ours with, flexible funding, pun intended, allowing us and trusting professionals to know what is best for our communities. And so the Pritzker Traubert Foundation's seminal Chicago Prize really allowed us to advance a unique investment, a community ownership model that will sustain our comprehensive community development work and other catalytic development projects in years to come in Auburn Gresham. And so we are ready for that development.
No, thank you. So a couple of things, as all of you have talked about, that I just want you to each maybe comment on. Clearly the system as it works now is somewhat broken. It doesn't work well for everyone. And so it would be good to get each of your ideas, and you've kind of said it, but more explicitly, what do you think is the most broke? And then you also have all kind of talked about this being a different moment. And I'd like to also hear from each of you, why do you think this is different? Why do you have belief that the things that we're doing today will get us to a very different place than what we've experienced for the last, several decades? So what's broke and why is this moment different? And Maurice, I'll start with you.
What's oh my, what's broke? Well, I have to say, the planning tradition in cities has not put neighborhood planning at the forefront of its efforts. You will find across the country the main focus and most of the resources were going to creating vibrant downtowns, riverfronts. You hear about those projects in cities where billions of dollars were invested in the engine of those cities, and very little was allocated for neighborhood development. Well, neighborhood development is where you use your community development block grant dollars, and it's all public, no private, and community organizations were literally left. They'll do that. They'll do the neighborhood stuff. There has been a paradigm shift, and I'd like to think that Chicago is one of those cities that's leading it, that are marshaling a vast portion of the planning apparatus towards neighborhood equitable development. And I literally reorganized our planning organization, where we now have groups that are solely focused on neighborhood scale development. And they work on it 24/7, and they learn those geographies. And I'm seeing other cities that have had great racial disparity in development reorganizing themselves in a similar way. St. Louis is going through this same process. Detroit has gone through this process, where we realize that the more sustainable, resilient form of development happens at the neighborhood scale. So I would argue that the whole structure of the planning department was broken. It was built to deliver the downtown that we all know that's successful. It was not built to lift up neighborhoods. So we've had to take this time to change that. And then I would even argue that the incentive structure has to pivot to capture far more of our tax increment to support neighborhood reinvestment. And taking that big audacious number that the mayor put out there, 750 million, and forcing it to go into the area of supporting projects like Carlos's project and others, and finding a way to shine a light on the work that he's doing. It's not by chance that the city's Invest Southwest opportunity site is right across the street from Carlos's building. It wasn't, he led the way. He said, go here. And the city's job was to surround his investment and other investments that would assure a long-term success. So I think that the organizational structure to deliver development has to be completely rethought. Chicago is in a leadership position, and I think as a result of the gross inequities that we have seen develop over time, you're seeing more and more cities pivot to this question. And I think the last year and the questions of equity have only accelerated that process. I'm just thrilled that Mayor Lightfoot saw this coming. She ran on this platform and she sought out a planning director who would share her view. And we have put this in place so that we are able to pivot as we come out of COVID to this new model.
Great. Carlos, you're nodding your head. You want to address those?
Yes, certainly. And the commissioner actually stole much of my thunder. But I mean, he is so right there. Oftentimes, what's not realized is that there are local community developers, local leaders in our communities that have the fortitude and the capacity and the ability to deliver if the opportunity presents itself. And the opportunity is really about capital, access to capital. One of the things that many of our many of my colleagues are always kind of frustrated about is this whole notion of, oh, you need capacity building help as a CDC or a CBO or local developer. So, no, what we need is capital. We have the ability, and we have the professionalism. I'm a former engineer. I've got partners in, around the city that are former banking and financial executives or architectural leaders and the like, who are now, really determined and dedicated to rebuilding their community. And so if the capital is available, and we have the skill to develop and to pull together a really concise and dedicated team to do a development project, it will occur. And one other thing that the commissioner mentioned, and I'm excited to hear that, yes, our Auburn Gresham Healthy Lifestyle Hub really inspired the development project, the RFP, here on the Auburn Gresham Invest Southwest. And that's the way community development really should happen. It's led by the community. Of course, there's a metro station coming online two blocks away, with heavy state funding. I mean, and so when you wrap all of these catalytic projects all together and you focus your energy around a specific community area or segment of the community, good things can happen. And that's the movement that is happening here in Auburn Gresham.
And Robin, you deal a lot with kind of thinking about what are the systems failures and how we think differently about it. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on kind of what's broke and then why is this different?
Sure. So I think there are a few things that are broken. First of all, excuse me, we make a separation in the way we deal with things between transactions, which are over here, and policies, which are over there. And I think what we've seen in our capital absorption work is that transactions are actually an outgrowth of policies. And by looking at what can and can't happen from a transactional standpoint, you learn an awful lot about what policies are and what they need to be. And so those things have to come together. The advocates who are saying, hey, we need more affordable homes, or we need a different kind of zoning, have to be informed by and working together with the people who are doing those transactions so that we can feed one with the other in a way that is, I think, a lot more integrated than the way we're operating now. The second thing I think is that right now we are spending a lot of money on things like healthcare, and we're not spending the money on the investments in society and in wellness that, if we put them into our neighborhoods and kept people healthy, would have led to a different result in the COVID pandemic and would lead to just a general uplift of people who are struggling. And so I think part of what's different now is we're seeing the consequences of some very short-sighted investment policies, which is what happens when things are in silos. So if we have, for example, a broken healthcare system, and we're not helping the hospitals and the health plans come into community as partners in the community investment system, then we're constantly playing catch up when we know right now that the social determinants of health are really what drive the outcomes. And then I guess I would say also that the concentration of wealth and the results that we see in how government functions and how society functions are certainly broken. And I think what's different now is we may have played to a point where people see with their own eyes what the consequences of that are. I certainly didn't think in my lifetime that we would see what we've seen even since January, let alone the last 4 years. So when I see people really mobilizing, when I see Stacey Abrams in Georgia, when I see people saying, hey, I may not have voted before, but I have to become active because leaving it to other people is just not an option anymore, that gives me a great deal of hope that there is a different way that we can be approaching these problems. And I think the issues of development and neighborhoods that we're talking about here are just an excellent place to start. We also have seen that there is going to be a giant flood of recovery money. We don't know exactly when it's going to come. We don't know exactly what form it's going to take. But what we do know for certain is that if communities get ready for it, they are going to be in line in a way that they will not be if they don't get organized with a pipeline of investable opportunities up front. Because we say, you know, the rain comes when it comes, and you have to be in a position to get wet. So I think one of the things that's different this time is that the 2008 to 2010 foreclosure crisis, loss of community wealth, was recent enough that many of the people like Carlos and others, you know, can remember what a tremendous setback that was. And I think we might be able to get ahead of it this time.
Great. Yeah.
No, there was just something brief that comes to mind when you talk about things being broken. I think the level of services that we have come to be dependent on during this COVID pandemic was just a real eye-opener. What it means to have a local quality grocery store in your neighborhood that you can walk to. The idea that people will be getting vaccinated and the pharmacies will play a major role, and you might not have a pharmacy in your neighborhood where you could go and be vaccinated. Or if you are so lucky to be able to work from home, that you might not have a broadband connection that allows you to access the internet and work from home. So they're like all of these basic things that we all take for granted that became so vivid that they're all broken when you're talking about Black and Brown communities. It's not nice to have a grocery store. It's an essential service. It's essential to have access to a pharmacy. And so it's kind of not by chance. When I think about the cluster of programs that Carlos is lifting up, you know, touches on healthy food, access to a pharmacy, access to medical assistance. And these things that may seem nice to have, I think over this past year have proven to be a part of a menu of essential services.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think there was a question in the chat, and I'll maybe just ask you to build out on that, is really what are the things? And you know, you kind of perfected this, what is it, 20-minute, 10 minute,
Yeah, 20 neighborhood.
20-minute
20
neighborhood where you have everything there. Say a bit about what is it that is important for a neighborhood to thrive and be successful? What are the elements? And another question, and you know, and this notion of the 20-minute neighborhood, another one of the questions in the chat, and anybody could answer this, but you know, how do things like art and culture figure into that as we think about what does it mean to have a neighborhood? Because we often think about the kind of bare necessities and don't think about what does it really take to have a neighborhood that's thriving. So maybe start with you, Maurice, with your 20-minute.
Sure. I talked about this in Detroit, and it was this idea of a 20-minute neighborhood, and it really resonated with Detroiters because they don't, 20 minutes, you don't walk to anything in Detroit. So the idea that you would be able to get to the range of services that you need in your daily comings and goings in your neighborhood within a 20-minute walk shifted the paradigm. So people started talking about, well, what is the pedestrian experience like? What am I walking to? You know, what's the experience of it? And how does transit integrate into that? And now I think we are all effectively living in 20-minute neighborhoods during the COVID environment. Many people are not having to come downtown for the first time in a very long time. And so what is it that you now use that is essential to the quality of life in your neighborhood? And I think it's revealing something inherent in Chicago's neighborhoods, that it's a city of villages. It's like 77 little villages. And they used to have everything as well as the cultural amenities. I mean, you'll find a glorious theater, the Regal Theater on 79th Street, the kind of theater you would expect to find downtown. It was embedded in a neighborhood. And so the very structure of the city was meant to create these self-sustained villages, 77 of them. And I actually think that that is a wonderful image for the future post-COVID of how all neighborhoods could thrive. And we have to put a particular focus on the South Side and the West Side that have been depleted of a lot of those cultural amenities. So I think one of the interesting takeaways of this year is I think there's gonna be a push to return to the village, of the village within the city, and that we can begin to, you could work, you can shop, you can recreate, and you can access cultural amenities within this geography that people know and love about the Chicago neighborhood.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Otherwise, I've got other things I want to probe on, but please, either of you.
I would just say about the arts that I think one of the things that we're learning as neighborhoods evolve is that people can stay in place and feel culturally displaced. And I think the role of a vibrant arts community and culture bearers in really keeping the sense of neighborhood, which infuses not just the businesses, but how people go about their daily life, is really important. And as we seek to engage people in setting priorities for their places, for their neighborhoods, you know, a lot of the old ways of doing these meetings just don't work. I mean, they didn't work before COVID, and they certainly don't work in a pandemic. And I think this is where we can really rely on the creativity of people who look at the world in a different way to help us move to a different way of engaging young people and engaging people who are not going to show up at a community meeting and sit for 2 hours.
And Helene, I just wanted to offer, as Commissioner Cox once again is reading my notes, especially as it relates to a classic Chicago community, and he did a great job really describing what historically that has meant, and access to all of those things that made up a classic Chicago community. Our theme for our Invest Southwest here in Auburn Gresham is to make Auburn Gresham and surrounding communities a walkable, livable, workable community. And that encompasses so much of what the Commissioner just described, and so many aspects of what a classic Chicago community meant.
And I am seeing some conversation around arts and culture and the role that artists play as local creatives. And I must admit, I think that the artists give communities a bit of their soul and their singularity. And we believe so much in this that together with DCASE, the mayor has launched an artist in residence program tied to the Invest Southwest communities, in which artists are brought in not to curate murals, but to actually infuse into the planning process a creative, innovative voice. So they're at the table. When we're talking about development, they're at the table. When we're talking about streetscapes, they're at the table. When we're talking about how we engage folks. So I see the integration of artists not as someone who curates the public realm, but who literally brings a level of creative, artistic thinking to the problem we're trying to solve. And I think this artist in residence program that we stood up is a way of honoring and dignifying, and those artists are coming from those very communities, and that program has started. So anyone who's interested in that should look at the Invest Southwest Artists in Residency program so you can see the role we think artists should be playing in this conversation about development.
So let me ask a couple of questions about some of our current challenges. And so, all of you have talked about COVID as being in some ways a positive, in the sense that it's highlighted issues that relate to investment and the recognition of the need for services within neighborhoods, et cetera. And so that it, in some ways it's serving as a motivating factor and an enlightening factor, if you will. On the other hand, we know that there's real economic harm that has been done as a result of COVID. So we're further in the hole. A lot of the communities that we're already disinvested in look like even less favorable for investment than before. So that's one thing. And then another for us in Illinois is that we're facing a real crisis, a fiscal crisis. We're not in great shape financially as a state, and that trickles down as well to the city. Maurice, I know you've gone through a city that actually went through bankruptcy, debt restructuring, et cetera. So I'd like to hear all of you talk a bit about, the COVID impact and what that might mean in terms of a disincentive for investment, and how do we think about it? And then the challenges of our fiscal condition, and what does that mean? And Robin, you're not in Illinois necessarily, but you've got a lot of experience thinking about some of those issues that might be helpful as we think about it in this context. So maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I guess I would say a few things. One is, there's no question that the devastation that has been wreaked on people, on governments, on businesses, small businesses, has been catastrophic. What I saw when I worked in Detroit, and I suspect that Commissioner Cox may have the same reaction, is that sometimes things get to a crisis point and then people can admit that there's a problem and be more creative and more honest about what it takes to actually dig out of the hole. So there's no question that this has been devastating, but I think the kinds of investments that we're talking about are the kinds of investments in infrastructure, and it depends on what you define as infrastructure. I think that having the right homes for people is just as fundamental to infrastructure as having a water system that works and recognizing the effects of climate change. If we are not going to use the moment to invest when interest rates are so low, and when the long-term payoff from doing the things that we must do as a society are going to happen, then I suspect that it'll just come down to convincing people who have donor advised funds that now is the time to deploy them. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to make an argument, not just to the people who've already taken their tax deductions and have money sitting in donor advised funds, but also to the public representatives of all of us, that, if not now, when? And I think what we've seen from Detroit is that some of these investments are actually not huge dollar amounts when we come right down to it. It's a question of choice making, and the choices need to be made in such a way that the neighborhoods that you were talking about at the opening, that have been historically disinvested, that have not gotten a fair share of resources, are going to this time come to the front of the line. So sometimes it's not about a huge dollar flow, it's about putting that money into the right places and catalyzing the kind of investment that can follow once the initial investments have been made.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. There's a resiliency in the scale of neighborhood development that we're talking about. Carlos's Healthy Hub, it's a $17 million investment. Imagine if you did that 17 times. That would constitute one downtown development. And you could create an entire ecosystem that is strengthened by this missing middle development scale. And it's also important because that also is development that emerging brown and Black developers can cut their teeth on and make a real difference. So, if I had $100 million, I'd rather do like 10 $10 million deals or $25 million deals than to do one $100 million deal. And so I think that was part of the lesson we learned in Detroit, if we go into the neighborhoods, the scale of the development changes. It's far more within reach of not, of those who we would like to see participating in a development process, and it creates a kind of tapestry that gets interwoven that becomes incredibly resilient. And so the Invest Southwest strategy is meant in very much to create a kind of catalytic investment and then a whole ecosystem of smaller opportunities around it. And then, by the way, the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, which is supporting 60 small business entrepreneurs, will get into the storefront scale of development. And by giving them, again, grants that are no bigger than $250,000. And you bring all those together, and I think you see the kind of vibrant strategy. I would not wish on anyone to have to go through a structured bankruptcy the way Detroit did. But what it did do was it forced the city to kind of take a clean slate and make a business case for reinvestment in neighborhoods with hard data, with capital markets aligned. So a business case was made. And I think that our process here in Chicago is effectively making the business case when we say that there's $160 million annually leaving Austin, and we can just capture a percentage of that. You can transform that community and every community like that on the South and West side.
If I can just hop in, one thing that we don't do very well that I think Detroit started to do was to quantify the cost of inaction. Because very often we don't do things because the benefits of doing them, are in a different pocket or they're scattered around. But when we start adding up those costs, those investments start looking pretty darn good because the social cost of not doing them is just so high. And what we have an opportunity to do before a crisis is to do that silo busting and really see what does it cost us not to do something, not only what does it cost to do it.
Let me move on because boy, the time is flying. So let me ask a couple other questions, and some of these are filtered from the Q&A and kind of combined. So one comment that people have made relates to the fact that we can make specific changes, but if the culture is so entrenched, it's hard to make a difference. And so, we know that there's this long-standing history of racial segregation, residential segregation. It's kind of hardwired into how we do business. Besides the things that we've kind of talked about, as we think about equity and how we can actually achieve equity, how do we also deal with and attack and approach some of the underlying issues of race and racism? And Maurice, there was a specific question to you that kind of said you can reorganize DPD, but do you change the culture? So I'd like all of you to kind of give your thoughts about what does it also mean to have the right mindset shift, culture shift, change in the way that we think about things from a race and equity lens if we're going to make a difference. And Carlos, maybe start with you.
Absolutely. Well, I would say, I would look at the Chicago Prize finalists, for instance, as a good starting point. Yes, we're the winner, Always Growing Auburn Gresham. It's the Healthy Hub project. It's the Renewable Energy and Urban Farming Campus, which is developed by Green Era and Urban Growers Collective, an African-American owned woman-led business. But GAGDC, the local CDC here, is a key investor in that venture. And those resources will come back to us, which will allow us to continue developing and investing in community projects and catalytic projects that otherwise we may seek outside investors. And we would likely seek outside investors at, anyway. But the other 5 finalists all had a multitude of, all have a multitude of shovel-ready projects. They all have teams of sophisticated developers with expertise. And the multitude of those projects need to be funded. Those developers need to be recognized as valuable developers from the community, local developers. And that's the way that, we will begin to kind of stem the tide, because here in our communities, we are doing the work for us and by us, and we are entrenched and here to stay, as opposed to a developer that may not look like us, may not have that deep rooted passion. It's all about the dollar, but it really, a lot of it really comes from the determination as well. So I would say the local community development work, community ownership models and the like are the things that Chicago and other cities should really be focusing their energy on.
If I can
Okay.
maybe
Go ahead.
say a couple of things. One is they always say when you're in a hole, stop digging. I've been very impressed in the reading that I've been doing over the last couple of years, how much of the structural racism that we see in housing and in neighborhoods is a function of intentional government action. So one of the things that we can do to stop digging is to stop having policies that intentionally or unintentionally reinforce the patterns that we're trying to break. So I think that's a function of advocacy, that's a function of voting, that's a function of making people aware. And when I see cities like Minneapolis doing away, for example, with single-family zoning, I think that there are some pretty creative moves that are being put out there. Carlos mentioned different ownership models that people are experimenting with, whether it's land trusts or other forms of community ownership, permanent affordability. I don't think there's a shortage of ideas. I think we're about to see a period of experimentation, both on the policy side and on the investment side, that are going to begin to give us some different ideas about what residential patterns might look like. And I think we're going to be led by a younger generation that just has different ideas about what normal is.
Great, thanks. And Maurice, and maybe say a little bit about how you thought about even your own department and what changes need to be made.
Well, it's speaking to Robin's point, it's a larger conversation about looking at policy more strategically. That is our tool. That is our tool. And so that is why Mayor Lightfoot said, while we do examples on the ground of equitable development, I want to look at all of the policies that impact what Chicago is, and that's the We Will Chicago plan, which has pillars around equity, diversity, and resiliency. And so we're putting it up front. Chicago is going to have to define what is equity. Is it equitable to have segregated neighborhoods or income exclusive neighborhoods? We're putting that in the forefront of a citywide conversation that will ultimately impact zoning, transportation, housing, you name it, allocation of resources. And so we definitely know that it's public policy that got us in this mess in the first place. And that if we don't have the fortitude to undo that policy and shift it towards a more equitable city, a more diverse city, a more resilient city, then all of these little projects that we do will make no difference. And so I think it's a question of both, and we cannot wait for the policy to change. We have to use every opportunity that's afforded us to demonstrate our values. And that's how we can go ahead and launch and Invest Southwest and talk about relentlessly about the South Side and the West Side and the West Side, while we have a citywide conversation about these other issues that ultimately will shape policy for a generation.
Great, thanks. And that was going to be my last question, and we don't have time for a last question. So that, this importance of policy. And so I'm glad we ended on that. And I would just say this has been a fascinating hour. It's hard to believe the time flew by so quickly. And I would, people often ask the game of like, if you had your choice of dinner guest, who would you invite? And they, say Nelson Mandela, Abe Lincoln, whatever. If I had my choice, I would invite Maurice Cox, Carlos Nelson, and Robin Hackey as my dinner guests to have another fascinating discussion. So thank you all for being such great panelists. Now I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the panelists, Maurice, Carlos, and Robin, for a great conversation. A big thank you for a special Chicago resident we are thrilled to have here, Dr. Helene Gale. I think it was an insightful conversation, the beautiful combination, mixture of hope and positive dreams about the future, but also very actual, concrete of how to drive change. I want to thank as well our media sponsor, WBEC, and the close to 300 participants today. So thank you, and have a great week. And when it's your turn, please get vaccinated. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.